Well, the UK is close to a trade deal with Australia, so Tim Tams are going to replace penguins and the UK will be better for it. But the UK farmers don't think they're going to do well out of it. What about hormone-fed Australian beef? And what about the economic arguments? Well, we visit Ricardo, look at the law of diminishing marginal returns and ask, is the whole idea a little flawed? Or when it comes to agriculture, was Ricardo right? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobby. Welcome along. Okay, so the UK has, in principle, agreed, Steve, to this first post-Brexit trade deal. I mean, there have been others, but they have been simple replacements to the trade deal that was already in place with the EU. So they just changed EU to UK, like Japan, for example. But this is the first one the UK has beaten the EU to, because actually the EU is trying to negotiate with Australia as well. So this is another of those is free trade a good thing moments, Steve. This one, we're told, will eventually increase UK GDP by as much as, now wait for it, 0.02%. It's going to save UK households as much as £34 million a year. That is 50 pence per person. That is 1 pence a week we will save as a result of this trade deal. So, I mean, first off, there's no such thing as a free trade deal, is there? Because they always come with many conditions attached. And, of course, they have to have conditions attached because there is no level playing field. Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, it's just free trade. Well, actually, there's an interesting question. If we did just have free trade, if we had no tariffs, we had open movement of goods, what would happen, do you think? Would it be a good thing or a bad thing?
You'd see a fair bit. One of the reasons for conditions on trade deals is normally, individual sectors and we're trying to protect their interests and not be completely exposed to the trade. But a lot of it is also standards. So if you let anybody ship anything they like to this country, then we'd be getting, as other countries, like Australia would be doing it, of course. Whereas other countries started decarbonising their vehicle fleet, you'd get cheap second-hand cars and they'd be imported by the billion into Australia and increase the pollution levels there, which doesn't seem to worry Australian politicians, but that would be the outcome. So it's one of the reasons you have conditions to maintain acceptable standards for commodities, and then that's a large part of the trade deals.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a very different approach to standards between the UK and Australia. So you wonder how this is going to work out, because a lot of it is touching on agriculture, which is generally one of those areas that you need to protect. Because, first of all, you need obviously need to ensure you've got food security. So you need to keep growing what you've got. But the interesting thing in the UK as well is, and this is where economics doesn't stack up too well, UK farming is such a significant part of the landscape. So it's part of the country's heritage. It's part of the environment. Economics is not very good at factoring in things like that, is it?
Well, this is where economics began in many ways, because what formed the current pattern of the English countryside was the enclosure movements. And these began when you started having capitalist farming taking over the previous feudal farming. And with the feudal farming system, the basic story was that there was I think it was called a feudal mence, which was titularly owned by the king and occupied by a lord, and the lord. So the lord held the land in behalf of the king, and then the lord would then be required to dole out a certain amount of land to his peasants to work on, and then there'd be land owned in communal sense to some extent, but also land owned by the lord themselves. And the peasants would produce what they needed for subsistence effectively on their own plots of land, and then they would work collectively on the lord's land, both for the lord's need for food and also for any trade that the lord would do with that food. And when you think about what that meant in terms of the pattern of the land holdings, I think it was a statute back in about the 15th or 14th century. Within these were the lords started to be rapacious as they behaved towards the peasants, and then there'd be peasant revolts. There were plenty of times peasants decided to be genuinely revolting rather than just in the cartoon caricature. And as one of the laws was passed by one of the kings of England was that the minimum amount of land that a peasant could be given on a feudal mence for their own use was 4 acres. Now, 4 acres as English land is a pretty substantial. It's quite a lot. It means you can grow enough for your family. And the usual story was that looking at and again, I'm not an expert on this. I'm relating what other people have researched and I've read. A normal life for a feudal peasant involved 2 days of working for every 1 day partying. You'd work 2 days and take one off, and that was the usual pattern. So you had small holdings everywhere. You had a large holding next to a feudal estate, and then you had the next feudal estate and the next feudal estate and so on. And the real beginning of capitalism was the realisation that there was money to be made in food, and rather than just doing it for maintaining the feudal system, you were now having merchants and feudal landlords turning it into agricultural holdings companies rather than the feudal system, and they do the enclosure. So they basically enclose the land, but the peasants would push the peasants off, and that's what formed the working class in the early days of England's industrialisation. You had all these people who were driven off the land, homeless. Originally they were landless labourers, and then as the industrial process grew, they moved into work in the burgeoning factories of 19th century, late 17th and late 18th and early 19th century England, and that was the growth of the original growth of capitalism. So what we've got is the remnants of the enclosure movement, with a tiny touch of what the feudal estates were about. It's a very different pattern to what it was when it was actually, in some ways, better for the peasants than they got under capitalism. But it's certainly that pattern has become part of the overall landscape of the country. And people, the English garden, they love that landscape. And the French have a similar attitude, but the French are actually much better at hanging on to small scale sort of peasant capitalist holdings.
Yeah. So 70% of the land in the UK is agriculture. So here's the interesting thing, though. If you just look at it from the point of view of hard economics, it's 70% of the land. It only provides 1.5% of the jobs and accounts for just 0.6% of GDP. So if you were looking at the efficient land use, you probably wouldn't farm. You'd be saying, well, okay, or you would be farming in a different way to try and increase that efficiency. But isn't this where we get into this? The whole argument, and I know how much you love the idea of the Ricardian argument that if we've got a limited amount of farmland, or we can't get any more, then importing from overseas is going to extend that farmland in effect because it reduces the impact of diminishing marginal returns. So, I mean, that would be the argument, wouldn't it, for for an Australian trade agreement, for example, that if we needed to produce more because we've got a growing population, and we're constrained by local production, then we're going to reach a stage where extra demand is going to push prices up. That's the idea, I know your favourite thing, of diminishing marginal returns, because we're going to run out of land, and therefore we get over that problem. That is the base argument, isn't it, for free trade? You get over that problem of diminishing marginal returns because you can just extend your land in effect because you buy from overseas.
Yeah, well, and that's a good way to put it too, because that's when it comes to land, there is some sense that the idea of diminishing marginal productivity, because Ricardo's original frame of reference was his own theory of rent, which said that initially when farming began, you would farm the best land and there would be no rent payable. You'd pay rent on the differential as you expand the population, and you've got to use less good land. Then that means the people who've got the good quality land have a bargaining chip with those with the poorer quality land, and with that bargaining chip they can demand rent. So that was Ricardo's fundamental theory of rent. That's a large part of what turns up in Henry George's work as well. And that is actually saying what you've got is diminishing productivity of one of the inputs, and the essential input, of course, to agriculture being land. So that's the way in which the idea of diminishing marginal productivity makes sense.
But, and there's always a but, of course, there is more to this podcast. If you want to hear what the but is, then you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon at patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. You can hear the full version of this podcast and all the other podcasts in this series, well over 200 now. We'll join you again again next week, though, for another one. We're going to look at trade unions next week. Do they have too much power, or did they have too much power? Do we need them back? That's next week on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. See you then.